The shadow of accumulation, overcoming greed, avarice, and materialism. The gardener who hoards seeds in fear of scarcity discovers too late that what was meant to flourish has withered in storage, while the one who plants generously finds that abundance multiplies when shared with the earth. You stand now in deeper understanding of the four essential nutrients that feed conscious living, knowing how time becomes sacred soil when treated with reverence, how attention flows like life-giving water toward what deserves to flourish, how energy radiates like sustainable sunlight through days aligned with natural rhythms, and how money serves as fertilizer that enhances rather than replaces the organic processes of authentic development. Yet, as you begin to implement this wisdom in the landscape of daily life, you may discover something both humbling and liberating. Even with clear understanding of resource stewardship, even with sincere intentions to live consciously, even with practical tools for wise allocation, there exist within the human psyche certain shadow patterns that can subvert the most well-intentioned efforts at conscious creation. These shadows take the form of ancient impulses toward accumulation, acquisition, and endless expansion that once served survival in environments of genuine scarcity, but now operate as invasive forces in a world of unprecedented abundance. Like vines that begin innocently but eventually strangle the very trees that support them, materialistic patterns can gradually consume the resources they claim to be gathering, creating a paradox where the more you accumulate, the less you feel you have. The tragedy of our time lies not in lack of resources, but in the misdirection of abundance toward purposes that cannot satisfy the longings they claim to serve. We live surrounded by material wealth that would seem miraculous to previous generations, yet rates of anxiety, depression, and spiritual emptiness continue to rise among those with access to more goods, services, and opportunities than kings of old could imagine. This chapter will guide you through the delicate work of recognizing and transforming the shadow patterns that can sabotage even the most sincere efforts at conscious resource stewardship. You will learn to identify when the natural impulse toward growth becomes corrupted into compulsive accumulation, when healthy desire transforms into consuming need, and when the tools of prosperity become obstacles to the very satisfaction they promise to provide. More importantly, you will discover how to compost these shadow energies, transforming the very impulses that once drove unconscious consumption into forces that support authentic development and sustainable satisfaction. This is not about eliminating desire or embracing artificial austerity, but about learning to direct your natural growth impulses toward forms of abundance that actually nourish rather than deplete the soil of your being. The path ahead requires courage to examine patterns that may feel so familiar they seem like essential aspects of your identity, and wisdom to distinguish between authentic needs that deserve fulfillment and conditioned cravings that can never be satisfied through external acquisition alone. The invasive vine, understanding materialism as misdirected growth energy. In the corner of every thriving garden, if you look carefully, you will find evidence of the eternal struggle between growth that serves the whole and growth that serves only itself. Here, an invasive vine wraps around the trunk of a fruit tree, its tendrils reaching toward the same sunlight that should nourish branches heavy with future harvest. The vine appears vigorous, its leaves glossy with apparent health, yet its success comes at the cost of everything around it. This vine began innocently enough, perhaps as a seed carried by wind or bird to soil already rich with possibility. In its early growth, it may even have appeared beneficial, adding green beauty to empty spaces, covering unsightly areas with verdant life. Yet somewhere in its development, the vine's growth impulse became corrupted from contribution to consumption, from adding to the garden's abundance to gradually strangling the very systems that made its own existence possible. Materialism operates in human consciousness according to these same principles of invasive growth, beginning as natural and healthy impulses towards security, beauty, and self-expression that become gradually corrupted into compulsive patterns that consume rather than contribute to authentic well-being. The neurology of never enough modern neuroscience reveals why materialistic patterns prove so difficult to satisfy, despite their promise to create security and happiness through acquisition. The anticipation of getting something new activates reward centers in the brain more intensely than actually possessing the desired object, creating what researchers call wanting versus liking systems that can operate independently of each other. This neurological reality explains why the excitement of planning purchases, browsing stores, or imagining ownership often exceeds the satisfaction of actually possessing acquired items. The pleasure centers that light up during anticipation quickly habituate to new possessions, returning to baseline levels that then require additional acquisition to recreate the same neurological rewards. The result is a biochemical treadmill where each purchase promises satisfaction that proves temporary, leading to increased need for novelty and stimulation to achieve the same psychological rewards. Like any addiction, materialism requires ever-increasing doses of consumption to produce diminishing returns of actual satisfaction. Yet unlike substances that create chemical dependency, materialistic patterns feel reasonable and socially acceptable, even admirable in cultures that equate consumption with success and status with worth. This social reinforcement makes materialistic patterns particularly insidious because they masquerade as appropriate responses to legitimate needs for security, beauty, and social connection, the alchemy of identity formation. Perhaps the most profound way materialism corrupts natural growth impulses involves its promise to provide identity and self-worth through external acquisition rather than internal development. In environments where human value gets measured by possessions, productivity, and social status, the authentic work of discovering and expressing your unique nature can feel less urgent than the external work of accumulating the symbols of success. This creates a devastating inversion where energy that could develop authentic capabilities gets redirected toward acquiring the external markers that symbolize those capabilities. The aspiring musician who spends more money on equipment than time practicing. The would-be writer who researches expensive retreats while avoiding the daily discipline of putting words on paper. The health-conscious person who accumulates fitness gadgets while remaining sedentary. The seduction lies in how acquiring the symbols of growth can temporarily satisfy the longing for actual development, providing just enough psychological reward to postpone the more challenging work of authentic skill building and character development. You can feel like a serious photographer by owning professional equipment, like an adventurer by purchasing outdoor gear, like a scholar by accumulating books, without engaging in the sustained practice that would actually develop these identities. This substitution becomes particularly problematic because it consumes the very resources, time, attention, energy, and money that authentic development requires. The money spent on symbols of expertise could have funded education or coaching. The time researching products could have been invested in actual practice. The mental energy devoted to acquisition could have supported creative work. The mirage of security through accumulation. One of the most persistent ways materialism corrupts healthy impulses involves its promise to provide security through accumulation, creating the illusion that enough possessions, savings, or status symbols can eliminate the uncertainty that characterizes all mortal existence. This promise proves particularly seductive because it contains a grain of truth wrapped in a larger deception. Having adequate resources does provide genuine security against many forms of suffering and limitation. Food, shelter, healthcare, and financial reserves can prevent or mitigate numerous difficulties that genuinely threaten well-being and freedom. The problem emerges when the impulse toward adequate security becomes corrupted into compulsive accumulation that operates according to the logic of more is always better and enough is never enough. This corruption transforms the healthy impulse toward reasonable preparation into anxious hoarding that actually undermines the security it claims to provide. The person who cannot enjoy current abundance because they're worried about future scarcity. The collector whose possessions require so much maintenance and storage that they become sources of stress rather than satisfaction. The investor whose obsession with accumulating wealth prevents them from using money to create the experiences and relationships that would provide genuine fulfillment. The deeper deception involves the promise that external accumulation can provide the kind of existential security that only internal development can actually offer. No amount of possessions can eliminate the fundamental uncertainties of aging, illness, relationship changes, and mortality that characterize human existence. Only the development of wisdom, resilience, adaptability, and inner peace can provide the kind of security that remains available regardless of external circumstances. Integration practice. Recognizing the invasive patterns. Begin identifying where natural growth impulses may have become corrupted into materialistic patterns that consume rather than contribute to authentic well-being. Acquisition motivation assessment. Before making purchases this week, pause to examine the underlying motivations. Are you buying this to meet a genuine functional need, to develop authentic capabilities, or to create specific meaningful experiences? Or are you purchasing to fill emotional needs, signal status, or provide temporary stimulation? Notice the difference between acquisitions that serve authentic development and those that substitute for internal work. Identity versus symbols. Exploration. Examine areas where you may be accumulating symbols of identities rather than developing the actual capabilities those identities represent. Where do you own equipment, books, or materials for activities you rarely engage in? What would it feel like to use what you already have rather than acquiring additional resources? How might the time and money spent on symbols be redirected toward actual skill development? Security versus anxiety. Recognition. Notice where the pursuit of security through accumulation may actually be creating anxiety rather than reducing it. Which possessions require maintenance, storage, or protection that adds complexity to your life? Where might the energy spent on accumulating resources be better directed toward developing the internal resilience that provides security regardless of external circumstances? The soil depletion crisis. How greed exhausts resources without creating value. A master gardener can assess soil health by observing what grows there. Understanding that depleted earth produces plants that appear busy with growth, yet yield little fruit, leaves that look abundant yet lack the vitality that comes from rich foundations. The soil itself tells the story of what has been extracted without being replenished, what has been taken without equivalent investment in the systems that create ongoing fertility. Greed operates in human experience according to these same principles of extraction without regeneration, creating patterns that appear productive while gradually exhausting the very resources they depend upon. The greedy mind consumes enormous quantities of mental energy through constant comparison, competitive calculation, and strategic positioning, yet produces remarkably little genuine satisfaction or meaningful contribution. This depletion operates across all four essential resources that conscious living requires, creating a form of internal soil exhaustion that makes authentic development increasingly difficult, despite external accumulation that may appear impressive to casual observation. The attention economics of insatiable desire greed operates as one of the most sophisticated systems for capturing and fragmenting attention, creating internal preoccupations that can dominate consciousness while producing no corresponding value in terms of satisfaction, relationship, or meaningful contribution. The greedy mind becomes a kind of internal stock market, constantly monitoring relative position, calculating advantages, and generating anxiety about opportunities that might be missed. This competitive consciousness consumes attention through several simultaneous channels that operate below awareness while exhausting mental resources. Social comparison monitoring that scans constantly for evidence of others' advantages or disadvantages relative to your position. Opportunity anxiety that maintains vigilant search for acquisitions, investments, or advantages that might become unavailable if not pursued immediately. Strategic planning that generates elaborate schemes for accumulation while rarely considering whether success would actually provide satisfaction. The cumulative attention cost of these greedy patterns often exceeds what would be required for substantial authentic development, yet produces nothing but increased anxiety and decreased appreciation for current abundance. The mental energy consumed by comparing your possessions with others could develop new skills. The attention devoted to monitoring investment accounts could deepen relationships. The consciousness absorbed by acquisition planning could create meaningful work or artistic expression. Perhaps most tragically, greedy attention patterns prevent the quality of presence that would reveal the abundance already available in current experience. The person obsessed with accumulating more that cannot appreciate what they already possess. The mind constantly calculating future advantage cannot inhabit present moment satisfaction. The consciousness dominated by comparison cannot recognize unique gifts that don't translate into competitive positioning. Time poverty through accumulation. Focused, the pursuit of material accumulation creates a peculiar form of time poverty where available hours get consumed by activities related to acquisition, maintenance, and protection of possessions rather than engagement with relationships, creative expression, and meaningful contribution that provide lasting satisfaction. This time drain operates through multiple channels that may appear individually reasonable, yet collectively consume vast quantities of life energy. Shopping time that includes not just purchasing, but researching products, comparing options, reading reviews, and traveling to stores or browsing online. Maintenance time required for cleaning, organizing, repairing, and protecting accumulated possessions. Management time spent tracking investments, optimizing accounts, and monitoring the performance of assets. Working time that extends beyond what would be required for reasonable security and comfort into the additional hours needed to afford lifestyle inflation and accumulated possessions that require ongoing financial support. Social time dominated by consumption activities rather than genuine connection, relationship building, or shared experiences that create lasting bonds. The hidden cost becomes visible when you calculate how much time accumulation patterns consume compared to activities that create authentic satisfaction and meaning. The weekend spent shopping versus hiking in nature. The evening researching purchases versus engaging in creative work. The vacation spent acquiring souvenirs versus experiencing local culture and natural beauty. This time allocation often creates the very scarcity it claims to solve, where the pursuit of security and satisfaction consumes the present moment opportunities for security and satisfaction that exist in relationship, creativity, service, and appreciation of current abundance. Energy depletion through competitive consumption. Greed exhausts energy through the chronic stress of competitive comparison, creating internal environments of scarcity and threat even amid external abundance. The nervous system cannot distinguish between a physical danger and social comparison, responding to perceived disadvantage with the same stress hormones that prepare for actual threats to survival. This competitive arousal becomes particularly depleting because it operates continuously rather than responding to specific challenges that can be addressed through direct action. Unlike fear of actual dangers that motivates protective behavior, comparison-based anxiety generates chronic activation without clear resolution, keeping stress response systems engaged without productive outlet. The energy cost compounds through several simultaneous processes that operate below conscious awareness while steadily draining vitality. Vigilance for threats to status or position that could emerge from others' success or advantages. Resentment toward those who appear to possess advantages you lack, creating internal resistance that requires energy to maintain. Anxiety about maintaining current position relative to others who might be gaining ground through their own accumulation efforts. Strategic thinking about how to improve relative position through acquisition, investment, or lifestyle choices that require mental energy while rarely providing clear action steps or genuine satisfaction when achieved. Suppression of generous impulses toward others whose success might threaten your comparative position, creating internal conflict between natural compassion and competitive positioning. The cumulative energy drain of these competitive patterns often leaves insufficient vitality for the creative work, relationship building, and authentic development that would provide genuine satisfaction and meaningful contribution. The person exhausted by comparison lacks energy for creation. The consciousness dominated by competitive calculation cannot access the flow states that make work feel effortless and fulfilling. Financial anxiety. Despite material abundance, perhaps the most paradoxical aspect of greed involves how it can create financial anxiety and perceived scarcity even amid objectively abundant resources. The greedy mind cannot rest in appreciation of current wealth because its attention remains focused on what others have, what might be lost, or what additional accumulation might be possible. This anxiety operates independently of actual financial situation, affecting people across all economic levels, who have internalized competitive comparison as their primary framework for evaluating financial adequacy. The millionaire who feels poor compared to billionaires experiences the same scarcity consciousness as the person struggling to meet basic needs, though their external circumstances differ dramatically. Greedy financial patterns create several forms of abundance blindness that prevent recognition of actual wealth and security. Habituation to current lifestyle that makes previously desired luxuries feel like basic necessities, creating perpetual sense of not having enough despite accumulation that would have seemed abundant in the past. Comparison with others' apparent wealth that creates relative deprivation, regardless of absolute abundance. Future anxiety that focuses on potential financial needs or market changes rather than current security and capacity, creating worry about scenarios that may never occur while preventing enjoyment of present abundance. Legacy concerns that transform appropriate financial planning into obsessive accumulation, motivated by fear of leaving insufficient resources for heirs or causes. The result is financial behavior that serves anxiety rather than wisdom, accumulation rather than circulation, hoarding rather than generous use of resources for meaningful purposes that align with authentic values and contribute to collective well-being. Integration practice. Recognizing resource depletion patterns. Begin identifying where greedy patterns may be exhausting your essential resources without creating proportional value in terms of satisfaction or meaningful contribution. Attention audit for competitive thinking. Throughout this week, notice how much mental energy gets consumed by comparison, competitive calculation, and strategic positioning relative to others. When does your mind drift toward monitoring others' advantages or disadvantages? How much attention goes toward acquisition planning versus present-moment engagement? What would happen if this mental energy were redirected toward creative work or authentic relationships? Time tracking for accumulation. Activities. Monitor how much time gets spent on activities related to accumulation, maintenance, and management of possessions rather than relationships, creativity, and meaningful contribution. This includes shopping, researching purchases, organizing possessions, and managing investments. How does this time allocation align with your stated values and priorities? Energy assessment for competitive stress. Pay attention to when competitive comparison or accumulation anxiety creates internal tension and energy drain. Which thoughts about money, possessions, or status generate stress responses? How does competitive thinking affect your availability for generous connection with others? Where might the energy consumed by comparison be redirected toward authentic development and contribution? The compost of contentment, transforming acquisitive impulses into generative growth. In the wisdom of organic gardening lies a profound truth about transformation that applies as powerfully to human psychology as to soil cultivation. The very materials that could poison a garden when left to accumulate and stagnate can become the richest source of nourishment when processed through conscious composting. Kitchen scraps that would attract pests and create rot when ignored become black gold when mixed with air, moisture, and patient attention that supports beneficial decomposition. The acquisitive impulses that drive materialistic patterns need not be eliminated or suppressed, but rather composted through conscious processing that transforms their energy from consumption to contribution, from taking to creating, from accumulation to circulation. This alchemical work requires understanding these impulses as misdirected life force that can be redirected toward purposes that actually satisfy the deeper longings they attempt to serve. The key insight is recognizing that beneath every materialistic craving lies an authentic need that deserves acknowledgement and skillful fulfillment, though not necessarily through the external acquisition the craving suggests. The compulsive shopper may be seeking the genuine pleasure of beauty and novelty. The status-conscious accumulator may be longing for authentic recognition and respect. The anxious hoarder may need the real security that comes from inner resilience and community of support. The practice of gratitude as abundance recognition. Gratitude functions as one of the most powerful composting agents for transforming acquisitive impulses, not through forcing artificial appreciation, but through developing genuine recognition of the abundance that already exists within current experience. This practice works by redirecting attention from what is missing toward what is present, from future acquisition toward current appreciation, from comparative evaluation toward direct engagement with immediate blessings. Effective gratitude practice goes beyond surface listing of obvious benefits toward deeper recognition of the complex support systems that make any experience of abundance possible. The food on your table represents not just nutrition, but the labor of farmers, the fertility of soil, the reliability of distribution systems, and the accumulated knowledge of countless generations who developed agricultural wisdom. The roof over your head connects you to builders, architects, the extracted materials of earth, and the social systems that make individual shelter possible within larger communities. This expanding awareness reveals that you live embedded in webs of abundance so vast and complex that complete accounting becomes impossible, creating natural humility that dissolves competitive comparison, while generating appreciation that makes additional acquisition feel less urgent and compelling. Gratitude practice becomes particularly powerful for composting acquisitive impulses when it includes recognition of non-material abundance that cannot be purchased or accumulated. The sunrise that appears freely each morning, the capacity for love and connection that exists independently of external circumstances, the creativity and intelligence that operate as gifts rather than achievements, the basic miracle of consciousness itself that makes all experience possible. Regular engagement with this broader understanding of abundance creates internal environments where materialistic impulses lose their compelling quality, not through suppression, but through recognition that the deeper needs they attempt to serve are already being met through sources that accumulation cannot enhance or threaten. Mindful consumption as sacred practice. Transforming acquisitive patterns requires developing what might be called sacred consumption, approaches to acquisition that honor both genuine needs and environmental interconnection, while distinguishing between purchases that serve authentic development and those that provide only temporary stimulation or social signaling. This practice begins with creating conscious space between impulse and action, allowing authentic choice about whether particular acquisitions align with deeper values and long-term well-being. The pause that asks whether this purchase serves genuine need or attempts to fill emotional void that material objects cannot address. The reflection that considers long-term impact on both personal resources and environmental systems that make consumption possible. Mindful consumption includes developing sensitivity to the difference between needs and wants, recognizing that healthy needs deserve fulfillment while compulsive wants often signal underlying emotional states that require attention rather than external satisfaction. The need for warm clothing versus the want for fashionable status symbols. The need for functional tools versus the want for impressive equipment that exceeds actual requirements. The practice also involves understanding the true cost of consumption beyond immediate price, including the time required to earn purchase money, the environmental impact of production and disposal, the space and energy required for maintenance and storage, and the attention consumed by acquisition decisions and ownership responsibilities. Sacred consumption naturally leads toward choices that provide lasting value rather than temporary satisfaction, that support authentic capabilities rather than symbolic identity, and that contribute to rather than extract from the larger systems of community and environment that make individual well-being possible. The alchemy of generosity. Perhaps the most powerful method for composting acquisitive impulses involves discovering how generous practices create the very abundance and security that accumulation promises but cannot deliver. Generosity operates according to principles that appear paradoxical to scarcity-based thinking, yet prove consistently reliable in actual experience. Generous sharing of knowledge, skills, resources, and attention often returns multiplied through network effects, reciprocal relationships, and the reputation that generous people naturally develop as individuals who add value to every situation they enter. The teacher whose generous sharing of expertise creates opportunities for paid work. The neighbor whose helpful contributions create community support during difficult times. The colleague whose generous collaboration leads to advancement opportunities. Generosity also provides direct psychological benefits that materialistic accumulation cannot match, creating sense of abundance through the very act of sharing while building relationships and community connections that provide security more reliable than individual resource hoarding. The satisfaction of contributing meaningfully to others' well-being. The sense of plenty that emerges from having enough to share. The social capital that develops through reputation as someone who enhances rather than merely consumes community resources. The practice includes developing comfort with what Buddhism calls generous circulation, understanding that resources flow most effectively when they move through systems rather than accumulating in stagnant pools. Money that circulates through local economies supports businesses and employment that create community prosperity. Knowledge that gets shared freely increases collective wisdom that benefits everyone, including the original sharer. Love and attention that flow generously create environments where everyone's well-being increases. This circulation principle challenges scarcity-based assumptions about resource management while creating actual abundance through conscious participation in systems larger than individual accumulation and protection. In integration practice, composting acquisitive energy, begin transforming acquisitive impulses from consumption patterns into generative practices that create authentic abundance. Gratitude expansion. Practice. Daily, spend time recognizing forms of abundance that exist independently of personal accumulation. Notice the free gifts constantly available through natural beauty, human creativity, community infrastructure, and the basic miracle of consciousness itself. How does this expanded awareness of abundance affect desires for additional acquisition? Sacred consumption experiments. Before purchases, create conscious space for evaluating whether acquisitions serve authentic needs and values or attempt to fill emotional needs through material substitutes. Ask, does this align with my deeper priorities? Will this enhance my capacity for meaningful activity and contribution? How will I feel about this purchase in the longer term? Generosity circulation practice. Look for opportunities to share knowledge, skills, resources, or attention in ways that contribute to others' well-being and community flourishing. Notice how generous practices affect your own sense of abundance and security. What returns in unexpected ways when you contribute freely to purposes larger than personal accumulation? The regenerative garden, creating resource patterns that increase abundance. In the most successful gardens, abundance becomes self-generating through design that works with, rather than against, natural principles of regeneration and circulation. Here, fallen leaves become next season's compost rather than waste to be discarded. Rainwater gets channeled toward plants that need irrigation rather than running off unused. Beneficial insects find habitat that supports their reproduction while they provide pollination services essential for fruit and vegetable production. These regenerative systems create what permaculture designers call abundance by design, where intelligent arrangement of elements generates increasing fertility and productivity over time rather than depleting resources through extraction-based approaches that cannot sustain long-term productivity. Your relationship with material resources can operate according to these same principles of regenerative abundance, where conscious stewardship creates patterns that build rather than deplete wealth, community, and satisfaction over time. This requires shifting from extraction-based approaches that consume resources faster than they regenerate towards circulation-based approaches that understand abundance as flow rather than accumulation. From extraction to contribution. Economics, the transformation from materialistic accumulation toward regenerative abundance begins with understanding the difference between extractive approaches that take value from existing systems versus contributory approaches that add value while meeting personal needs. This distinction revolutionizes everything from career choices to purchasing decisions to investment strategies. And extractive approaches attempt to acquire wealth, status, or resources by taking from others or from natural systems without providing equivalent value in return. This includes work that profits from others' disadvantages, investments that extract wealth without creating corresponding value, consumption that depletes environmental resources without regenerative compensation, and accumulation strategies that remove resources from circulation rather than enhancing their productive flow. While extractive approaches may appear successful in short-term financial terms, they create long-term instability by undermining the very systems they depend upon for continued success. The business that profits through exploitation eventually faces labor shortages or regulatory backlash. The investor who extracts value without creation contributes to market instability that affects everyone, including themselves. The consumer who ignores environmental impact creates degradation that reduces quality of life for entire communities. Contributory approaches seek to meet personal needs while simultaneously adding value to larger systems, creating what business theorists call win-win-win scenarios, where individual success supports community prosperity and environmental regeneration. Work that solves genuine problems while providing meaningful livelihood. Investments that support businesses creating positive social and environmental impact while generating reasonable returns. Consumption that supports local economies and sustainable practices while meeting authentic personal needs. The shift toward contributory approaches often requires releasing short-term thinking that prioritizes immediate extraction in favor of longer-term perspectives that understand individual well-being as inseparable from collective flourishing and environmental health. The circulation principle in resource flow, understanding abundance as circulation rather than accumulation, transforms resource stewardship from hoarding-based strategies toward flow-based approaches that recognize wealth as movement rather than possession. This perspective draws from both ancient wisdom traditions and modern systems thinking to create practical approaches that generate prosperity through generous participation in larger economic and social flows. Money circulates most effectively when it moves through local economies, supporting businesses and employment that create community prosperity, which benefits everyone, including the original spender. Purchasing from local businesses rather than distant corporations keeps wealth cycling within community systems that provide employment, tax base, and social fabric that support individual well-being along with collective prosperity. Knowledge and skills multiply when shared rather than hoarded, creating educational ecosystems where everyone's capabilities enhance through mutual learning and collaboration. The expert who teaches freely often discovers that sharing expertise leads to opportunities, connections, and insights that would not have emerged through protective secrecy about professional knowledge. Social capital increases through generous attention and support that creates relationship networks providing security, opportunity, and meaning that individual accumulation cannot match. Time invested in community building, volunteer work, and mutual support creates social infrastructure that benefits contributors while strengthening collective resilience and well-being. The circulation principle challenges zero-sum thinking that assumes others' gain requires your loss, revealing instead how generous participation in productive circulation often creates abundance for all participants through network effects and collaborative multiplication of individual contributions. Investment versus consumption consciousness. Regenerative abundance emerges through understanding the difference between investments that build long-term capacity versus consumption that provides temporary satisfaction without creating lasting value or capability. This distinction applies not just to financial decisions, but to choices about time, attention, and energy allocation that either enhance or deplete overall system health. Financial investments that support businesses creating positive social and environmental impact while generating reasonable returns create alignment between personal financial growth and collective well-being. This includes supporting local businesses, renewable energy development, education and healthcare systems, and companies whose practices contribute to, rather than extract from community and environmental health. Education and skill development investments enhance capacity for creating value while providing security that does not depend on external economic conditions. Learning that develops abilities for meaningful contribution creates opportunities that exist regardless of employment market conditions, while building capabilities that compound over time through practical application. Health investments that support physical vitality, emotional resilience, and mental clarity provide foundations that enhance every other aspect of life, while preventing the much larger costs of illness and low capacity that poor health creates. Preventive care, quality nutrition, regular movement, and stress management create exponential returns through maintained energy and avoided medical expenses. Relationship investments through shared experiences, generous attention, and mutual support create social capital that provides security, opportunity, and meaning that financial accumulation alone cannot provide. Time spent building authentic connections creates networks of mutual support that enhance both individual resilience and collective prosperity. The key insight is recognizing that investments in capacity, relationships, and regenerative systems create compound returns that accumulate over time, while consumption provides immediate satisfaction that depletes resources without building future capacity or contributing to larger systems that support ongoing prosperity. Legacy thinking and intergenerational stewardship. The ultimate expression of regenerative abundance involves expanding perspective beyond individual lifetime toward intergenerational stewardship that considers how current resource choices affect future generations and the long-term health of natural and social systems that make individual prosperity possible. This expanded temporal perspective naturally reduces materialistic accumulation by revealing how short-term extraction often creates long-term costs that exceed immediate benefits. Environmental degradation that profits current consumption while creating cleanup costs and health impacts for future generations. Educational and infrastructure neglect that saves current expenses while creating larger future costs for communities and nations. Social inequality that concentrates current wealth while creating instability that affects everyone, including the wealthy. Legacy thinking includes understanding current choices as votes for the kind of world you want future generations to inherit, transforming everyday decisions about consumption, investment, and resource allocation into expressions of intergenerational care and responsibility. Supporting businesses whose practices contribute to environmental regeneration rather than degradation. Choosing products and services that demonstrate social responsibility and community support, rather than maximum extraction for minimum cost. Intergenerational stewardship also involves developing and sharing knowledge, skills, and wisdom that contribute to collective capability for addressing challenges that require collaboration across communities and generations. Environmental restoration, social justice, technological development that serves human flourishing, and cultural preservation that maintains wisdom traditions while adapting to changing conditions. The practice includes using current abundance to create systems and institutions that will continue generating benefit after individual involvement ends, understanding personal prosperity as opportunity for contribution rather than just accumulation. Supporting education, healthcare, environmental protection, and social systems that enhance collective capacity for thriving across generations. Integration practice, creating regenerative abundance patterns, begins shifting resource stewardship from accumulation towards circulation patterns that create abundance through generous participation in larger systems. Contribution assessment and evaluate current work, spending, and investment patterns for their impact on larger systems beyond personal benefit. Where do your choices contribute to community prosperity, environmental health, and social well-being versus extracting value without equivalent return? How might you gradually shift toward more contributory approaches that align personal success with collective flourishing? Circulation experiments. Look for opportunities to participate in productive circulation of resources, knowledge, and support that benefits everyone, including yourself, through network effects and community building. This might include supporting local businesses, sharing skills and knowledge freely, participating in community organizations, or choosing investments that create positive social and environmental impact. Legacy perspective integration. Consider how current resource choices affect future generations and long-term system health beyond immediate personal benefit. How do your consumption patterns, investment decisions, and resource allocation contribute to the kind of world you want to leave for others? Where might intergenerational thinking inform different choices that serve both current needs and future well-being? The shadow patterns of accumulation, greed, and materialism need not become permanent obstacles to conscious resource stewardship. Like invasive vines that can be transformed into beneficial compost through patient processing, these impulses can become sources of energy for authentic development and regenerative abundance when understood and redirected with wisdom and skill. The transformation requires neither eliminating desire nor embracing artificial austerity, but rather learning to distinguish between cravings that can never be satisfied through external acquisition and authentic needs that deserve fulfillment through approaches that contribute to, rather than extract from the larger systems that make individual well-being possible. When acquisitive impulses become composted into grateful recognition of existing abundance, when competitive accumulation transforms into generous circulation that creates prosperity for all participants, when extractive consumption evolves into regenerative contribution that builds rather than depletes community and environmental wealth, then resource stewardship becomes not just personal practice, but participation in the larger work of creating sustainable prosperity for all life. This composting of shadow patterns prepares you for the sophisticated work ahead, learning to allocate resources according to natural rhythms and cycles that honor both individual development and collective flourishing, creating systems of stewardship that work with, rather than against, the deeper patterns that govern all sustainable abundance. The soil of consciousness has been enriched through transforming obstacles into nutrients. Now comes the artful work of seasonal allocation that allows authentic priorities to flourish through conscious timing, consistent cultivation, and patient trust in the natural processes that create lasting satisfaction and meaningful contribution.